Yorùbás will say that tí n bá sọ fún yín pé iná ń jó lórí omi, ẹ má máa bá mi jiyàn mọ́, ṣe ni kẹ́ ẹ ní kí n lọ kérú ẹ̀ wá. If I told you that there is a fire burning atop the waters, do not argue with me, simply demand his ashes of me. So let's start with what has Nigeria planted, so that you can recognize what Nigeria is reaping. And we will do so using last week's and the last 10 days protest as the template for our deductions. That way we will not, you know me, I enjoy the sound of my voice, but this way we can restrict the discussion and place it within the context of our objective realities. Each one of us can see. So what I'm going to do is this. It's too simplistic to be telling you that if you planted okra, you cannot reap cocoa, because it is what you have planted that you will reap. There is cause and then there is effect. But I didn't want to title this cause and effect too, because it's slightly different and it has to go back to the roots. Cause and effect dealt with what you were seeing in the moment. This one, let's try and unpack things a bit so that we both understand exactly where we're traveling from, what was planted, to explain what you and I are seeing being reaped on a daily basis. For the fathers have eaten sour grapes. Sour grapes. And the children's teeth are set on edge. Okay, so sour grape, seed. Yes. Teeth set on edge, harvest, cause and effect. Everything comes with consequences. Every country grows on the back of hegemonies. I dealt extensively with this in my second book, The Imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution. I laid the foundation in the first book, the Do Not Die in Their War. Do Not Die in Their War gives you a soft introduction to Nigeria and its many foibles. Imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution may be likened to when you take milk away from babies and you finally give them meat to chew. But a lot of you have avoided reading. So I'm forced to go back to what I'd already dealt with in the imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution. And what did I deal with? I dealt with the feudalistic foundation of the Nigerian state. Every system is designed to do something or the other. Systems do not occur by accident. They are functions of the desires of the designers. So if I wanted to design something with which to drink water, I wouldn't design this. But if I desire something that will contain liquid, I'll probably have something like this, right? They don't pay me, I know they advertise them. So I'll have something like this in a bowl contained, or a cup, right? So Nigeria was designed for a purpose. The British, its original owners, who are still in truth its owners, designed it in order to extract maximum value from it for the benefit of those who are not within Nigeria. It's for the benefit of those outside Nigeria. So it's essentially like an extractive industry. Now, when it gained independence in 1960, it was bequeathed a system intended to preserve the prerogative of its owners. In spite of the best efforts of the founding fathers, superior knowledge of the original owners assured that ownership retained in the hands of the owners. But how did they do this? When the British came to Nigeria, the British are famous for the introduction of what is known as indirect rule. Indirect rule means that the colonizer takes the existing structure of governance and then layers his own hegemony over and on top of the existing structures of governance. So the British were ruling the rulers who continued to rule their people for the benefit of the British. Are you following? So when the British came, the most perfect system that was in existence and that was analogous to their own historical system was feudalism. Feudalism was prevalent in what is today known as northern Nigeria. It didn't rule everywhere, but it was prevalent. There were already two Islamic empires in northern Nigeria by the time the British came. You had the Kanem-Borno Empire, and you had the Sokoto Caliphate. So when the British came and either defeated, as they defeated, I believe, at Tahiru, was that 1904, thereabout? I'm not too sure now. Is it 1894? I'm not sure. You can go and check your history. When the British defeated the Sokoto Caliphate, they effectively became the owners of the Sokoto Caliphate. And the Sokoto Caliphate, with the Emirate systems, ruled on behalf of the British. That was the indirect rule in northern Nigeria. Now understand this. There were vast pockets of population that had not been conquered by either the Fulani or the Borno Empire. In some cases, because they simply couldn't. Those people probably occupied terrains that made it impossible for them to be subjugated by cavalry, or because they deliberately refused to conquer those places. Those of you who are Muslims, follow me. In Islamic principles and doctrine, you have what is known as Dar Islam. That is the land occupied by the faithful Muslims. And then you have Dar Abre. That is the land occupied by unbelievers. When a land is occupied by fellow Muslims, a Muslim ruler cannot wage war unjustly except to correct an apostate ruler who is going to lead his people to sin against Allah. Except that be the case, he does not have legitimacy to wage war against a fellow Muslim. So, the Fulani slave raiders deliberately refused to conquer parts of northern Nigeria, even though they had the capacity to. What they did was to build garrisons in parts, and then they come they come in numbers during certain seasons, mostly just before the harvest. They come in hordes from the Sahel with the cattle. It was time to feed cattle on things that had been planted by the farmers in the areas where they had determined that they were going to be raiding for slaves. Slaves were an essential article of trade in this trans-Saharan trade route. The trans-Saharan trade, particularly slave trade, precedes the transatlantic slave trade by at least 200 years or more. Go and read your history. It's up to you. I think about 300 years, actually. The trans-Saharan slave trade had been going for years, and the accurate records being kept. I remember Lamido Sanusi, now one of the two emirs in Kanu, saying at the time that they still had records dating back centuries in the Kanu Emirate palace, because that was the primary article of trade. I warrant that if anybody should look through those books as revealed by Lamido Sanusi, I warrant that you find that the main article of trade were human cargoes. So what you call the middle belts today were largely either unconquerable or deliberately left unconquered. The North Central, what you call Benue, Taraba, largely FCT because of the terrain, the Baris, a vast part of what we commonly refer to as northern Nigeria, as if it were to be one homogeneous whole, were people who were not conquered or could not be conquered by the Fulanis or the Borno Empire. So what simply happened was that when the British came, they simply layered over that and then subjugated people who were not necessarily part of any emirate system before then, who were not subject to the Fulani. They became subject to the Fulanis because it was convenient for the British. So feudalism, which is the Fulani rulership concept, was exported. Even existing structures were feudalized. Existing chieftaincy structures were feudalized, as the whole of Nigeria, anyway, eventually became progressively feudalized. What does this mean? It simply means that the Fulani governance structure, which allows for the stratification of society along class lines, the peasantry, the privileged, and then the ruling class. That's the broad category out. Let me just give you those broad categories. The important thing is that if you were born a commoner, you knew you were going to live and die as a commoner. If you were born privileged, you knew you were born and you would die privileged. Each person knew his place and very few aspire. And the only way any even move is by military prowess. So sometimes a peasant who is in the military might, perhaps, and I'm just saying this because it can't be ruled out and because that is the history, normal history of feudalism, because the British started with pretty much the same route. So, what has Nigeria planted? What did the British plant? The British did not plant a country that was found on equity, that was found on justice, or that was found on the common interest of the people. It was found to serve interests different from those of the people. And they handed this to an hegemony. This hegemony is completely feudalistic in its outlook. That hegemony shaped northern Nigeria. That hegemony was the one that was given the Nigerian veto. Now, don't get me wrong. Every society, every country develops on the back of hegemonies. Hegemonies means the overriding influence in any space. The Fulani hegemony was given an hegemonic veto over the Nigerian state from the beginning of its creations. If you read the book, Imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution, you'll find these historical facts. And I say facts because they were recorded by persons who were part and parcel of the erection of this system. Sir Richard Brooks, I believe, he wrote a book, and I quoted him extensively in the Imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution, wherein he explained the assurances and guarantees that were given to the northern intelligentsia and traditional class in the lead up to the creation of the Nigerian state and its independence. I'm talking about documents going back to as far back as 1948, where it was agreed that half of the members of the Legislative Council would come from the northern Nigeria. So it's not something that started today. It was there from its foundation. So this hegemony was handed Nigeria. And when those who presume to think that they could compete with that hegemony democratically were eventually ousted between 1962, 1963, and then the resultant coup of January 1966, And then the assertion of hegemonic powers of July 1966 and the resultant civil war, that hegemony effectively took control of Nigeria after the second coup. And that hegemony restructured Nigeria from a federal structure of 4 regions into what we have today, 37 states, no thanks to the corrupt judiciary that has now legislated, or rather, more or less, legislated a 37th state. So you've got 37 states in Nigeria today, a product of the hegemony that has governed Nigeria. So what has that hegemony planted? Because now, believe it or not, your governor is an emir. I've dealt with all of these. Whether you are in, Imo State, for instance, Oples Uzodima, you didn't vote for him, but he's there. He's an emir by the imposition of the Nigerian Sultan, who was at that time Buhari, and his lease of emirship has now been extended by the grace of Bulaba. So don't let's argue this thing. The important thing is understand very clearly that Nigeria has been completely feudalized. Your rulers are Fulanis. Fulanis not necessarily in terms of blood, because even the Fulani who is related to the Fulani by blood is himself a victim. I'm speaking strictly about the governance system. They are feudal lords. Whether you are talking about simple Sim in rivers, they are not connected to the people. They do not derive their legitimacy from the people. No, not even that one. That one still hasn't rigged his own election to come in yet. Whether you're talking about my dancing brother in Osun State, who is not even of the APC, let's be clear, it's not about party affiliation. Whichever part of the country you turn to, what you find very quickly is that the rulers are alienated from the people. They are Fulanis, feudal lords. Now, what has the feudal lords of Nigeria planted? Because if I said seed time and harvest time, to understand what has been planted, we now need to go and look at what has happened over the last 10 days. Let's start, for instance. Now, what can you see generally in the midst of, I think it's best, let's deal with this sectorally. So let's start. What was planted in the north? What did we see? What were the seeds? And what were the fruits that we saw in the north? We saw libraries looted. They didn't loot books. Remember that popular meme joke that was going around online about how a place in, I think it's Turkey, thieves stole, they didn't take books. Well, it happened live. We saw it in Nigeria. A public library was looted. They even carried dustbin, but nobody touched books. The tragic thing is that I think once Kaliwag once said that if you wanted to hide something from the black man, put it in books. Well, they didn't touch the books. They carried dustbin. I saw videos of young men, these were very strong men, tearing up the campsites, drainage slabs, breaking them to extract the scrap metal. Yeah, I saw that. I saw, they stole traffic lights. Traffic lights. A dear friend told me of what happened in his own village, which is a local government headquarters. The local government warehouse was looted. The fertilizers in there looted to the ground. But you know the more interesting part? Policemen came to carry their own. They didn't stop the looters. Soldiers came to carry their own. They didn't stop any looters. So you find that the looting was rife. And then they went further. They started sharing these incendiary WhatsApp messages calling for people to attack politicians in their homes, loot it, burn it, kill them. They started carrying Russian flags up and down the place. They started calling for the military. We saw all that. Those are the harvests. Question is, what was planted? Ignorance was planted. Yeah. Divisions, ethno-religious divisions were planted. Bigotry was planted. Poverty planted. Religious indoctrination to hatred was planted. All these were planted. And that was what battered what you saw. Let me break it down. For a system that institutionalizes inequity to be tolerated, you must necessarily render the victims stupefied. In order to achieve the task of stupefaction, feudalism routinely deploys 3 weapons. The first is poverty. Now, reverse that. The first is ignorance. The second is poverty. The third, not necessarily in these orders actually, is religion. Most of the time, the 3 are deployed simultaneously. But what I'll do is I'll take the effect of each one by one. When you deploy ignorance against a man, what you have done in essence is that you have limited his capacity to think his way out of his problem. The system does this in multiple fashions, and do not for once imagine that the ignorant are the ones who have not gone through formal education, to universities, polytechnics, or even secondary school for that matter. Those are not necessarily the ignorant. The ignorant are those who cannot use their minds to do anything of consequence. Those are the ignorant. So when a person is ignorant, the person is incapable of thinking his way through his problem. You now have a situation where the government of Nigeria deliberately keeps the people stupid. The educational policy is not designed to liberate the mind. It is designed to produce useful idiots. You still have people talking about the advantages of colonialism. History is not taught so that you do not have a recollection of where you're coming from. We have engineers graduating, civil engineers, but we still have Chinese engineers superintending road construction in Nigeria. We can't build because we are not allowed to build our own technology because we do not teach our own technology. Our medicine is lost. The knowledge of our medicine is largely lost because we've been taught to abandon and deride it institutionally. Now, when you render a people ignorant, it becomes easier to keep them poor. So the second leg of the weapon is poverty. What the poverty has done is to keep the people existential in their outlook. A man who is constantly looking for what to eat. Hunger drove the last protest. So it's no longer something that is not common. It's now common to every part of Nigeria. Hunger is common to everyone now. So you keep a people stupid, you keep them poor, so that you focus, even those who are still eating, they are worried about losing their capacity to eat. So a lot of people are silent in the face of the all-consuming evil because they are afraid that if they would speak, they will lose their capacity to guarantee their next meal. So ignorance, poverty, and then you've got religion. I have spoken to this multiple times, but it is particularly important that I speak to it again so that we have some clarity. Religion, as a word, comes from Latin, religio, or Old French, religare, both of which means, loosely translated, it means to bind. I have had the privilege of having some very useful dictionaries in my life. One of them was the World Book Dictionary. It came in 2 volumes and it had illustrations. So when you went to check the word religion, He will give you the etymology, that's the origin, but he has illustrations. At least the one I had when I was growing up, he had illustrations. And it will show you a finch, small bird, very flighty, just a little bigger than the hummingbird, but very flighty. It then shows you this bird with his wings tied in a bow. So the purpose of religion is to fetter your mind. So when you have, the purpose of fettering your mind is to ensure that you do not think outside acceptable parameters, which is why it's easy for somebody to tell you he's Muslim, you must hate him, or he's Christian, he should be hated, or he's a Shia Muslim, he's not human. Do you understand? So religion is intended to fetter the mind so that the human mind, which is desperately wicked, would not think outside acceptable parameters that might threaten the convention as defined by those who found religions. I'm not knocking religion. Don't worry. I'm also a Christian, even though I don't go to church. So don't worry. You can be as religious